Hi, I'm Danae Johnson, and this is Reg Watch by RegulatorWatch.com, the only platform dedicated to watching the watchers. Greenhouse gas emissions and climate change is a top issue for many Canadians heading into this year's federal election. Concern over the impact of rising temperatures and what to do about it at times seems at odds with protecting Canada's economy, hit hard by the collapse in oil. The specter of falling oil prices loomed large over last week's leaders' debate as all three candidates addressed the impact of lost jobs, government revenue, and the failure of not getting pipelines with Tidewater access online. Our political leaders are not the only ones feeling the heat. Regulators are too. Anti-pipeline activists are fighting to make climate change a key issue in the pipeline approval process, and declining sea ice in the Arctic is proving to make their case. Roundly acknowledged as the authority on climate change measurement is the National Snow and Ice Data Center. The NSIDC is NASA-funded and provides scientific analysis on Arctic sea ice conditions. When you hear in the media that sea ice in the Arctic is melting, the data comes from the NSIDC. They've been tracking the minimum and maximum amount of sea ice called the ice extent since satellite records began in 1979. NSIDC data released last week shows the Arctic sea ice minimum extent for 2015 is the fourth lowest on record. This follows news last March that the maximum extent of Arctic sea ice reached in 2015 was the lowest ever recorded. In fact, sea ice levels in the Arctic have been declining for years. What does this mean? Well, there are skeptics who don't believe the data, so RegulatorWatch.com combed through over 11,000 sea ice measurements going back over 35 years, and we found it's more than just a troubling trend. Despite some ups and downs, it's clear Arctic sea ice maximums and minimums have declined dramatically. But what about the Antarctic? You know, the other extremely cold place on the globe. Well, here's the catch. While sea ice at the North Pole is declining, the sea ice at the South Pole is growing. Yes, you heard that right. It's a little harder to find on the NSIDC website, but here it is. Arctic sea ice continues low, Antarctic ice hits new high. In 2014, the sea ice surrounding the Antarctic continent continued to break winter records, following record maximum extents in 2012 and 2013. The Antarctic sea ice growth is as equally dramatic as the Arctic's decline. This is more than a trend, and NSIDC scientists say the reasons for the rapid sea ice growth is unclear. Joining us today to help us better understand what's going on with the sea ice and climate change is Julian Strobe, Senior Scientist at the National Snow and Ice Data Center. Julian, thanks for joining us. First off, tell us, what's going on with sea ice?
Well, as you would expect with temperatures continuing to rise, the sea ice has been retreating quite a bit, especially in summer. So when we look at sort of long-term trends, when we have satellite data that goes back pretty consistently until about 79. We see huge declines in the amount of sea ice covering the Arctic Ocean in summers. And at the end of the summer melt season, there's about 40% less ice today than there used to be, in the 1970s, 1980s.
That's dramatic. What's the impact of that?
Well, one of the key implications of that is, so if you are losing the sea ice, which is highly reflective and reflects a lot of the sun's energy back out to space, but if now you remove that sea ice, you then expose a darker ocean to the sun's energy. So the ocean starts to warm up, which then also enhances the melt. But one of the key things that we're seeing, especially in the Arctic in autumn, is that before the ocean can freeze again in the wintertime, it has to release all the heat that it's gained during the summertime. So you see this large amplified warming in the Arctic compared to the rest of the planet, which is in part driven by the fact that you've been losing the sea ice.
Julian, is there a difference between sea ice and glacier ice?
Well, there is a difference, and it's really important to point that out. So sea ice is ice that forms on the ocean. So when the ocean freezes in the wintertime, ice starts to form. And that ice is very different from glacier ice, which comes from land. And so one of the key fundamental differences is that when the sea ice melts, it doesn't necessarily raise sea level.
So Julian, based on the best evidence, what's causing the loss in sea ice?
I guess we would estimate from looking at the data and looking at climate model projections that probably about 50% of the decline in the Arctic sea ice right now is probably due to greenhouse gases, and the other 50% is due to natural climate variability.
Okay, you mentioned variability. We just introduced our viewers to NSIDC data showing that while Arctic sea ice is decreasing, Antarctic sea ice is growing. Do we know what's causing the discrepancy?
Well, the Antarctic is a bit different, and it's taken scientists a little bit by surprise, only because when we look at our climate model simulations, they forecast the Arctic sea ice going away as the observations are showing, so they tend to be in agreement with each other. In the Antarctic, that's not the case. The models suggest that the Antarctic ice should also be decreasing right now, but it's not. And so one of the things that we've noticed with the Antarctic is there seems to be a change in the wind pattern around the continent, so a strengthening of the westerly winds. When people look at climate model simulations, they do suggest that perhaps the change in this wind pattern that we're seeing and the strengthening of the westerlies could be a result of the ozone loss. So that's one explanation that scientists have been looking at, but it is a bit of a puzzle right now because we're not able to get the trends in the Antarctic correct with our models, for example.
It sounds like it's a bit of a mystery.
It is a bit of a mystery. There's a lot of studies that suggest it is changes in the wind regime that's causing it. Other studies suggest that enhanced melting of Antarctica itself, so the ice shelves, the floating ice shelves, the glaciers of Antarctica, are actually changing the properties of the water column that are then causing new ice to form, new sea ice to form in the ocean. So there's a couple different ideas that are out right now.
Well, that's it for this edition of Reg Watch. Before you head off, please like us on Facebook and don't forget to follow us on Twitter. For RegulatorWatch.com, I'm Danae Johnson.